The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 was not just a battlefield loss, it was a dramatic collision between American inexperience and German mastery of desert warfare. When the Wehrmacht's seasoned Afrika Korps, led by the brilliant Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, launched its offensive through the narrow Tunisian mountain pass, the United States Army experienced the brutal reality of modern mechanized combat for the first time. Although America had entered the war more than a year earlier, its ground forces had yet to face a large German armored formation. The result was a devastating defeat, with 6,500 American casualties and a near total collapse of their defensive lines. But Kasserine would become something much more important than a moment of failure. It became the turning point that forced the fastest military transformation of World War II. Before the battle even began, systemic weaknesses plagued the U.S. II Corps. Many officers were inexperienced in coordinating large formations, artillery responses were slow and poorly synchronized, and tank destroyer units were scattered in small platoons across vast front lines instead of being massed together where their firepower could make a difference. American forces, used to theoretical training back home, suddenly faced the hard truth. Textbook maneuvers were nothing compared to the brutal efficiency of Rommel's armored thrusts. German tanks broke through weak intersections, their infantry pushed aggressively, and their artillery targeted American communication hubs with pinpoint precision. The chaos was magnified by confusing command structures. Orders reached units late, reconnaissance was unreliable, and many field commanders failed to apply basic combined arms principles. Tanks charged forward without infantry. Infantry attacked without artillery, and artillery units fired without proper fire direction systems to coordinate cross-battery support. The result was predictable. The American lines fractured under pressure. Yet what makes Kasserine so extraordinary is not the defeat itself, but what happened immediately afterward. Instead of retreating into excuses or denial, key American leaders, Dwight Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, and the newly appointed commander of Second Corps, George Patton, launched a rapid, ruthless, and honest assessment of everything that had gone wrong. They relieved ineffective officers, rewrote tactical procedures, and forced strict discipline, reorganized armored units, and standardized communication protocols across all formations. It was the birth of the American culture of adaptation. Kasserine Pass was a humiliation, yes, but it also became the moment when American forces confronted their weaknesses with brutal honesty. That willingness to learn, change, and rebuild under pressure would soon transform the U.S. Army into a force capable of facing and defeating the best German divisions in North Africa.
In the immediate aftermath of Kasserine Pass, General Dwight D. Eisenhower understood something essential. Losing once was understandable, but failing to learn from the loss would be unforgivable. The defeat revealed not one or two isolated mistakes, but a system-wide failure spanning leadership, coordination, training, logistics, and tactics. Eisenhower responded with a sweeping transformation effort that touched every level of the U.S. Army in North Africa. The first and most visible change was the appointment of Lieutenant General George S. Patton as commander of Second Corps. Patton's arrival was like a storm. He enforced discipline brutally: uniform standards, weapons handling, marching drills, and constant training under battlefield conditions. Many soldiers resented it at first, but Patton understood a fundamental truth of warfare: discipline under pressure saves lives. His presence alone boosted morale. His energy was contagious. His confidence reminded American troops that defeat was not destiny. Eisenhower also reorganized artillery command structures. One of the biggest failures at Kasserine was the slow and uncoordinated use of artillery. To fix this, the U.S. Army implemented a revolutionary fire direction system that allowed multiple artillery batteries to fire simultaneously on the same target with unprecedented accuracy. This system, built on rapid communication and centralized fire control, would later become one of the most decisive advantages of American forces throughout the war. Tank destroyer doctrine was also rewritten. Instead of scattering tank destroyers piecemeal to support infantry units, commanders were instructed to mass them in battalions, creating concentrated anti-armor firepower capable of countering German armored formations. Training emphasized ambush tactics, hull-down positioning, and coordinated support with artillery. Eisenhower encouraged a culture of honest self-criticism as well. Officers were expected to evaluate their own mistakes and adopt new methods quickly. This openness to change contrasted sharply with the rigid traditions of many other armies at the time. Military historian Gerhard Weinberg later emphasized that the U.S. Army accomplished in months what took the British 3 years to learn: the power of adaptation. These reforms were not simply academic, they were battle-tested almost immediately at El Guettar.
When George S. Patton took command of 2nd Corps in March 1943, he found an army demoralized, disorganized, and uncertain of its own abilities. Soldiers who had never faced German armor before were shaken by their defeat. Yet Patton understood that psychological recovery was just as important as tactical adjustments. He restored belief through discipline, through visible leadership, and through clear expectations of performance. Patton began with order. Vehicles had to be maintained meticulously. Helmets and weapons had to be carried at all times. Patrols were increased, training intensified. Officers were held accountable for every failure and praised for every achievement. He personally inspected frontline positions, often exposing himself to enemy fire. This wasn't recklessness, it was symbolism. His troops needed to see that their commander lived by the same standards he demanded from them. But Patton's greatest contribution was tactical clarity. He reorganized the front into defensible positions, ensured that artillery could support advancing infantry, and prioritized reconnaissance so that American forces would never again be surprised the way they were at Kasserine. Under his direction, tank destroyers were positioned to create deadly crossfire zones. Infantry was trained to work alongside armor effectively, and supply lines were streamlined to ensure consistent ammunition and fuel availability. Patton believed the U.S. soldier, once trained properly, was the equal of any fighting man in the world, and he set out to prove it on the battlefield. His reforms would soon be tested in the coming confrontation with the German 10th Panzer Division.
The Battle of El Guettar on March 23, 1943, stands as one of the most important turning points in American military history, not because of its scale, but because of what it represented: proof that the United States Army could take a devastating defeat, study it with brutal honesty, change everything that was broken, and return to the battlefield a stronger, smarter, and more coordinated fighting force. In just 27 days after the humiliation at Kasserine Pass, American forces demonstrated at El Guettar that they had transformed from an inexperienced army into a disciplined, adaptive, and dangerous opponent, capable of standing toe-to-toe with the German Wehrmacht. When the sun rose over the rugged Tunisian hills that morning, the men of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division were not the same soldiers who had scrambled back in confusion at Kasserine. Now, under the direct leadership of Lieutenant General George S. Patton, they had drilled relentlessly, reorganized their defensive positions, refined their artillery procedures, rewired communication systems, and reshaped their tank destroyer tactics. Patton's insistence on discipline, boots polished, weapons spotless, trucks aligned, helmets strapped, was not simply military showmanship, it was the psychological reconstruction of an army preparing itself to face the enemy who had beaten them only weeks earlier. The German 10th Panzer Division, however, did not expect resistance of this intensity. Fresh from victories and fully confident in their superiority of tanks, tactics, and experience, the German commanders assumed El Guettar would be another easy breakthrough. Their plan followed the classic Afrika Korps pattern: a fast armored thrust through the center, supported by overlapping waves of infantry and artillery, designed to shatter American lines before they could mount an organized defense. It was a formula that had crushed countless unprepared units. But this time, the Americans were ready. At dawn, German reconnaissance vehicles probed the American forward positions, testing their range and response time. Instead of the confused and scattered defensive fire typical of earlier engagements, they were met with a coordinated artillery strike directed by the newly implemented fire direction system. Multiple American batteries fired simultaneously, landing shells in tight patterns with precision that shocked the German observers. This was not the poorly synchronized, slow-reacting artillery force that had crumbled at Kasserine. This was a unified, responsive system capable of bringing overwhelming firepower onto a single target within seconds. As the main body of German armor advanced, American tank destroyer units, now massed together instead of scattered piecemeal, opened fire from well-concealed hull-down positions. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, positioned along the flanks, created deadly crossfire zones that forced German tanks to maneuver into kill pockets. This was the new.
In the aftermath of the devastating American defeat at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced one of the greatest crises of his military career. His army, new, inexperienced, and untested against the battle-hardened Afrika Korps, had suffered 6,500 casualties and been thrown into disorganized retreat by German forces that seemed faster, smarter, and far more coordinated. Yet from this disaster emerged one of the most astonishing military transformations in modern history. In just 27 days, Eisenhower reshaped the U.S. Army from a scattered, confused force into a disciplined, combined arms machine capable of stopping the German war machine in its tracks. Eisenhower's first step was brutally simple. He demanded honesty. Senior commanders were ordered to provide direct, unfiltered assessments of every failure. No excuses, no political maneuvering, no sugarcoating. Reports flooded in describing communication breakdowns, officers who refused to leave their tents under fire, artillery units that could not coordinate their barrages, and tank destroyer platoons scattered so widely that they were useless when German armor attacked. Eisenhower took this information not as an indictment, but as a blueprint for rebuilding. His second step was to address the leadership crisis. Several senior officers were relieved of command, an unprecedented act in the middle of a campaign. Eisenhower believed incompetent leadership was more dangerous than enemy bullets. In their place, he elevated commanders known for decisiveness, courage, and adaptability. The most famous of these was Lieutenant General George S. Patton. With Patton's arrival, the entire culture of the Army changed overnight. Patton implemented a new system of discipline: strict dress codes, rapid movement, constant drills, perfectly maintained weapons, and immediate punishment for negligence. To many soldiers, this felt excessive, but Patton understood something deeper. Discipline is the foundation of confidence, and confidence is the foundation of victory. His reforms were not about appearances. They were about building a psychological backbone strong enough to face the Germans again. Meanwhile, Eisenhower focused on structural transformation. Communications became the top priority. Radio networks were expanded, encryption improved, and units were drilled repeatedly to master quick, accurate battlefield messaging. No more delayed orders, no more units fighting in isolation, no more confusion over who was responsible for what. Next came artillery. At Kasserine, American guns had suffered from slow reaction times and inconsistent targeting. To fix this, Eisenhower adopted revolutionary British techniques: a central fire direction center that could instantly coordinate multiple artillery batteries onto a single target. Forward observers were trained to work in pairs. One man spotted targets while the other relayed coordinates. By the time these reforms reached the battlefield at El Guettar, American artillery was capable of delivering some of the most devastatingly accurate fire of the entire North African campaign. Eisenhower also overhauled tank destroyer doctrine. The original concept, light, fast vehicles that hunted tanks, worked well on paper, but failed in real combat. Instead of roaming independently, tank destroyers were reorganized into concentrated battalions, placed in ambush positions with overlapping fields of fire. They were no longer hunters, they were traps. This new doctrine would prove critical when German panzers attacked at El Guettar. Training intensified across the entire army. Units rehearsed defensive lines, fallback positions, night operations, and coordinated counterattacks. Machine gun teams drilled until they could deploy in seconds. Mortar crews practiced firing while under simulated artillery bombardment. Engineers learned to build roadblocks, dig anti-tank ditches, and lay mines faster than ever before. Every soldier understood not just his own job, but the role of every unit fighting beside him. Perhaps the most important change was philosophical. Eisenhower fostered a culture of institutional flexibility, the belief that the Army must constantly adapt, learn from mistakes, and never cling to outdated doctrines simply because it had worked in training manuals. This mindset would become a defining characteristic of the U.S. Army for the rest of the war. All of these reforms came together in March 1943 at the Battle of El Guettar. The difference was immediate and stark. The Americans who had once been overwhelmed at Kasserine stood firm against one of Germany's best armored divisions. Artillery barrages landed with pinpoint accuracy. Tank destroyers fought as a unified force, knocking out German armor from concealed positions. Infantry used cover intelligently, maneuvered independently, and executed textbook defensive tactics. Communications flowed smoothly across the battlefield, and most importantly, the American soldiers believed in themselves. The result was a decisive U.S. victory and the first major defeat of German armor by American forces in the war. For Eisenhower, El Guettar confirmed that his reforms had worked. The army that had failed at Kasserine had not only redeemed itself, it had become the core of the force that would liberate Europe from the hills of Sicily to the beaches of Normandy. The transformation sparked by Eisenhower after Kasserine Pass is now studied in military academies worldwide as a model for rapid organizational adaptation. It stands as proof that a military's greatest strength is not firepower or technology, but the ability to learn, change, and rebuild even in the face of catastrophic defeat.
The campaign in Tunisia during early 1943 was far more than a series of battles. It was the classroom in which the United States Army was forced to grow up, faster, harder, and under worse circumstances than any American force had ever experienced. What happened between February and April of that year shaped the army that would later storm the beaches of Normandy, fight through the hedgerows of France, break the Siegfried Line, and ultimately defeat Nazi Germany. The transformation was not only tactical or technological, it was cultural, institutional, and psychological. Tunisia became the birthplace of the modern American way of war. Before Tunisia, the U.S. Army entered North Africa with confidence, but not competence. Many officers had never seen battle. Units lacked coordination. Equipment was good, but doctrine was outdated. The Army was not ready for an enemy like the German Wehrmacht, which had been fighting non-stop since 1939. The disaster at Kasserine Pass exposed all of these weaknesses at once. For 2 days, German armor sliced through American positions, creating chaos, severing communication lines, and overwhelming unprepared infantry. American tanks were outmaneuvered, artillery fired too slowly, and commanders often hesitated at critical moments. It was a painful initiation into modern warfare. But what made the U.S. Army different from other armies that had faced similar setbacks was its reaction. Many militaries retreat into denial when confronted with catastrophic failure. The Americans did the opposite. Senior leaders, including Eisenhower, demanded unfiltered reports, harsh self-criticism, and immediate structural changes. They believed that mistakes were not shameful. Refusing to learn from them was. Tunisia forced the U.S. Army to identify exactly what needed to change. The first lesson was the absolute necessity of combined arms coordination. In North Africa, American infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, and air support often operated separately. The Germans, by contrast, fought as an integrated machine. Tanks supported infantry, artillery shaped the battlefield, engineers cleared obstacles, and air units attacked supply lines. After Kasserine, the Americans embraced this philosophy. Units were trained to communicate constantly, support each other, and move as one unified body rather than isolated components. The second lesson was the importance of communication. Radios were scarce, encryption slow, and many officers relied on runners or field telephones, methods easily disrupted by enemy action. After Tunisia, the U.S. Army expanded its radio network dramatically. Each company received more sets, and officers underwent intensive training on fast, clear transmission. It became standard practice that if a unit could not communicate, it could not fight. Third came leadership. Tunisia exposed a painful truth. Some American commanders were not prepared for the realities of modern war. Eisenhower relieved several officers who froze under fire or failed to coordinate their units. In their place, he appointed younger, aggressive, and more flexible leaders, men like Terry Allen, Paul Robinette, and Lucien Truscott. These commanders trusted their subordinates, encouraged initiative, and understood the value of rapid adaptation. The U.S. Army began cultivating a leadership style that rewarded boldness rather than caution. Training also changed dramatically. Before Tunisia, American soldiers had rehearsed predictable, textbook scenarios. After Tunisia, training became realistic, chaotic, and stressful, designed to mimic the pressure of combat. Units practiced night fighting, rapid redeployment, anti-tank ambushes, and defensive withdrawal. Live-fire exercises became common. Soldiers who had once relied on orders learned to improvise. Another major shift came in artillery doctrine. Tunisia proved that American artillery, though powerful, was too slow to react. The adoption of the British quick-fire system, which centralized fire direction and allowed multiple batteries to engage a target instantly, became one of the greatest strengths of the U.S. Army. By late 1944, German officers described American artillery as the most terrifying they had ever faced. The tank destroyer doctrine also evolved. Initially, American planners believed that fast, lightly armored vehicles could roam the battlefield and hunt enemy tanks. Tunisia demonstrated the flaw in this. Tank destroyers were reorganized into battalions positioned in ambush lines supported by infantry and artillery. They became defensive weapons used with precision, not reckless hunters. This revised approach proved highly effective at El Guettar and throughout Italy. Perhaps the most important lesson Tunisia taught was adaptability. The U.S. Army discovered that the side which learns fastest wins. American units became experts at capturing German equipment, studying it, and immediately developing countermeasures. They analyzed German tactics, understood their strengths, and exploited their weaknesses. They embraced decentralized decision-making, empowering junior leaders to act without waiting for higher command. This mentality would later prove crucial in the fast-moving battles of France and Belgium. By the summer of 1944, the army that landed in Normandy was almost unrecognizable compared to the force that had been routed at Kasserine Pass. It was an army with hardened leadership, precise artillery, flexible tactics, reliable communication, and a doctrine built on constant improvement. Tunisia was the painful forge in which this army was created. In the end, the transformation in Tunisia was not just about winning battles. It was about creating a military institution capable of evolving faster than its enemies. The willingness to learn, adapt, reform, and decentralize became defining strengths of the American war effort. The soldiers who marched across Europe carried with them the lessons learned in the rocky valleys of North Africa. And because of those lessons, they would not merely fight, they would win.